February 23rd presidential and National Assembly elections, and the March 9th gubernatorial and state houses of assembly elections. IRI and NDI observers covered all 6 geopolitical zones and all 3 election day missions. To many Nigerians, the 2019 elections were an opportunity to consolidate democratic gains and build on sound electoral practices. Significant improvements in the administration of the 2011 and 2015 elections boosted expectations for the 2019 process. However, the IRI and NDI observation mission concluded that the 2019 elections did not meet the expectations of many Nigerians. The IRI-NDI mission identified a number of key issues related to the 2019 process. To start, I'll discuss the Nigerian-led initiatives that contributed positively to the process. In preparation for the 2019 polls, Nigerians sought to increase citizen participation, particularly that of marginalized populations, to enhance confidence in the elections and minimize the risk of electoral violence. The Not Too Young to Run campaign, led by a coalition of civil society organizations, resulted in the constitutional amendment that lowered the minimum age limit for elected officials at the national, state, and local levels. The percentage of youth candidates subsequently increased from 21% in 2015 to over 34% in 2019. Oh, it's not on. The number of women candidates also increased, and 6 women ran for president. The Access Nigeria campaign also resulted in the use of the Braille ballot guide, which supported visually impaired Nigerians to vote on election day. Several citizen organizations and networks monitored various aspects of the electoral process, demonstrating a significant commitment to strengthening democratic institutions and processes in Nigeria. With regards to election administration, ahead of the 2019 polls, INEC instituted several reforms, including simultaneous accreditation and voting, the posting of results at polling units, improved voter verification technologies, a more robust review of and disciplinary process for INEC staff, and enhancement of ballot secrecy and measures to reduce vote buying. In January 2018, more than a year before the polls, INEC released an elections timetable but had trouble following it due to delayed allocation of electoral funds, failed attempts to reform the electoral legal framework, and numerous pre-election disputes over political party primaries that delayed ballot production. The last-minute postponement of elections on the morning of February 16th and delays in opening some polling units and other administrative challenges on February 23rd undermined public confidence in INEC. The Commission did not communicate sufficiently with political parties and the public about election preparations, and such a late postponement likely depressed voter turnout and created confusion about the duration of candidate and party campaigning. While INEC distributed materials and opened polls in a more timely fashion on March 9th, many serious irregularities occurred, including vote buying, intimidation of voters and election officials, and election-related violence. Both polls, however, were administered generally in accordance with election procedures. On to the role of political parties. Political parties remain the weakest link among Nigeria's nascent democratic institutions. Candidate nomination processes were opaque and reportedly plagued by vote buying, rigging, and confusion over the location of the primaries and who could participate in them. In some instances, party leadership submitted candidate lists to INEC with nominees who had not won their primaries. Intra and inter-party disputes over the primaries led to violence in some states and more than 800 court cases, many of which were not settled by Election Day. The paucity of women and youth nominated to run on the tickets of the 2 major parties, the APC and PDP, demonstrated Nigerian political elite's lack of commitment to opening space for new faces and new voices. Women now hold only 3.8% of seats in the National Assembly, the lowest level of women's representation in any legislature in sub-Saharan Africa. Ahead of the 2019 polls, the poor security situation in Nigeria raised concern about the safety of voters and candidates. To ease rising tensions, the National Peace Committee convened political parties and their presidential candidates to sign 2 peace accords. Despite these accords, politically motivated violence rose and political actors used increasingly inflammatory language as Election Day approached. While voting was generally peaceful in most of the country, at some polling units, party agents and other party supporters disrupted voting, intimidated voters, and destroyed voting materials. Party agents also acted with impunity in assisting voters to mark their ballots and violating the secrecy of the ballot. During the March 9th polls, most police and unarmed security did conduct themselves with restraint. However, credible citizen observer groups expressed grave concern over the heavy military presence in some areas and disruptions that contributed to many canceled votes, inconclusive election results, and the need to conduct supplementary elections for some contests. In Akiti states, citizen observers raised concerns about the increasing and increasingly brazen practice of vote buying. In an attempt to curb the practice, INEC instituted new measures to protect the secrecy of the ballot, including prohibiting the use of cell phones in the voting booth and rearranging the layout of polling units. Still, during the February 23rd and March 9th polls, our observers witnessed vote buying at polling units as well as party agents assisting voters in marking their ballots. Finally, on electoral reform, as you all know, in 2018, the National Assembly approved 4 versions of a bill to amend the Electoral Act. The President's last rejection of the bill in December 2018, just a couple of months before Election Day, surprised most stakeholders and delayed the release of INEC's election guidelines. Other legal reforms to the electoral process were unrealized before the 2019 elections, including creating appropriate institutions to oversee political parties and prosecute electoral offenses, all responsibilities that currently impede INEC's focus on administering elections. There is a pressing desire among Nigerians for a national conversation about the future of their democracy, which must begin with addressing the clear and urgent need to resume the electoral reform process that stalled prior to the 2019 electoral process. I'll now turn it back over to my colleague, Dr. Fomunyo, to discuss our recommendations, which we hope will be part of this national conversation.
In the spirit of international cooperation, the IRI NDI mission urges Nigerian stakeholders across the board to seriously consider these and other recommendations to improve the electoral process, unlike in previous years when suggestions by reputable citizen and international observation missions went unheeded. On the legal framework and electoral dispute resolution, pursue a comprehensive, inclusive, and expeditious electoral reform process. Establish time limits for the adjudication of pre-election petitions. On election administration, complete the constituency delineation exercise and identify necessary polling units at least 1 year before the next elections. Make the continuous voter registration process more accessible to voters. Develop and adopt a strong strategic communications plan. Reconsider the order and timing of general elections. Create a process that facilitates suffrage for those on official duty on election day. Adopt more transparent procedures for the tabulation, transmission, and announcement of election results. On political party conduct, urgently commit to and complement measures to strengthen mechanisms for political party internal democracy. Develop and campaign on issue-based platforms that reflect citizen priorities and build the capacity of political parties to monitor elections. Civic engagement. Improve coordination among stakeholders to increase and deepen voter and civic education. Continue efforts to enhance the participation of marginalized groups, including women, youth, people with disabilities, and internally displaced persons, IDPs. On election security, continue to improve coordination between security agencies and INEC on the provision of electoral security, and enforce electoral laws by investigating and prosecuting perpetrators of election-related criminal acts. That's a summary of our recommendations, and the details with relevant explanations can be found in the report that is now being distributed.
Several committees were established to discuss, review, and make recommendations to improve the electoral process in Nigeria. However, these reforms were not codified into law, leaving Nigeria with a weak electoral system in law. The most important issue coming out of the 2019 elections is the need to move quickly on electoral reform. As we look forward to 2023, how do you see the prospects for comprehensive reform?
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Well, my opinion, I feel Nigeria has a lot of fantastic laws and policies existing. What is lacking is the implementation and effective enforcement of those laws to give the effective rules, the effective needs and benefits that come with those laws. So I think for a comprehensive reform, we need to look at it from different angles. While it is being pushed at the National Assembly for it to become a law, there's also a need for the comprehensive education of the larger society of the people to get to understand the effect and the importance of the existence of such laws in the country. And that requires that these capacities have to deal with the political leadership of the country. Political leaders need to understand their responsibilities in educating people on what their responsibilities are and the functions and the duties they perform in the office. Another thing I also look at is the political ignorance of the majority of the people. You find that most of these policies and laws are being discussed either at the National Assembly or at the cities where very few people who actually get to participate in this election are concerned about. So in most cases, the people at the grassroots, those who actually turn out for voting, or those who participate in the electoral processes at the grassroots are not informed. In most cases, we find that voter education or training of electoral officers gets to be done at a very close time to the election. So there is no much time for people to comprehend and consolidate on the learnings of the benefits of such policy. So that needs to be tackled, and it needs to begin now, not until 2023 when elections are actually there. And I also think that there's a need for the effective use of the political structures within Nigeria. We have student union bodies who are the key persons participating in electoral rallies, campaigns, and all sorts of activities at the grassroots. But then we find out that there are no programs to effectively guide these young persons in their various leadership responsibilities in school. So I feel that the proper engagement of those young people at that level, quite a lot of politicians starts at the universities and polytechnics and even community leadership. So I think for us to begin to solve this problem, there should be a strategic approach to it, not just looking at 2023, but let's look at 4 or 5 elections ahead and let this education begin now. And I think there should be a comprehensive or a collaborative effort that even at the National Assembly, we have 360 members of House of Representatives, and then we have 109 senators. What it means is that the entire country is well represented. They run constituency programs, they run constituency projects. I think there should be a conscious or intentional effort to engage these politicians to have that level of capacities being trainings in their own constituencies, in collaboration with civil societies, and also as part of government responsibilities, where we have government allocate huge sum of money for politicians, particularly members of the House of National Assembly, to run constituency projects. I think something from this perspective should also come from the government, and it should be budgeted and itemized with specific roles that this should be conducted, and then there should be an assessment to actually ensure that these things are conducted. To leave it to civil societies who only request for funds when elections are at the corner is not enough. To leave it to National Orientation Agency to do that is not enough. I think we must be intentional about it, and it needs to be done now. I would like to point out the reference, to make a reference to the Yaga Not Too Young to Run campaign. It was quite intentional, it was conscious. Apart from engaging the legislators at the National Assembly, there was that engagement with civil societies at the grassroots, with young people at every corner. So you can see that there was that result that came from the National Assembly for the bill to actually be assented by the President. And you can see the number of young people that emerged into the National Assembly and also the state houses of assembly. So there should be that conscious and intentional effort starting now, not until 2023. Thank you.
As a freshman legislator from the great state of Gombe, Chairman Yusuf with us, because Chair, you have participated in a number of these reform committees, and you were even the vice chair of the Ken Money Committee. One of the recommendations that has been made by previous delegations from IRI and NDI, and also from many Nigerian groups, has been to disentangle INEC, to take away from INEC the responsibility of managing some of the externalities beyond the scope of election administration. And one of the areas that has been highlighted has been the area of dealing with election-related offenses, electoral offenses, and the slow pace of prosecution, which in many cases gives the impression that impunity, that people can commit electoral offenses with impunity. What is your take with regards to that disposition or that recommendation that a specific commission be stood up to deal specifically with election-related offenses?
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, clearly, it is very clear that INEC is overburdened. INEC is the electoral management umpire in the country, but it also is required by law to do other things other than elections. INEC keeps a voters register. INEC is involved in voter education. INEC is involved in, of course, regulating political parties. And then, of course, it's also involved in prosecuting of electoral offenders. I think all these responsibilities can be unbundled and reassigned to other institutions that are already existing and doing this taking this kind of responsibility. We have, for example, a National Identity Management Commission. Why can't we actually assign the responsibility of creating a voter register or an identification mechanism with which that can be used by citizens to go out and vote, so that INEC doesn't have to get involved in registration of voters. In other countries, election commissions are only involved in conducting elections. Now, having said that, I'm also not a supporter of proliferation of commissions, whereby now we create a separate commission in order to deal with electoral offenders. I think election offenses have their roots in the structure of our governance institutions. Why are people so desperate to get into government? Because election offenses have their roots in the desperation by individuals to be in public office. Why are people so desperate to be in public office that they are willing to visit this level of violence and fraud and all sorts of crimes on society? So we need to address that, because the offenses are a manifestation of a much deeper problem. But having also said that, I think that we already have law enforcement agencies that can deal with these offenses as common crimes, because mostly they are associated with violence. And violence is just a common crime. If you visit violence on a community, you should be treated as a common criminal. Or fraud, or even money laundering, where people, use money in order to buy votes. Now there is an element of money laundering in that kind of scheme. So we have institutions that are already performing these functions, and but what we need to do is to strengthen these institutions and make them perform their role instead of creating a separate institution for that purpose. I, of course, as you said, was a member of the NDI committee. The committee also recommended a creation of electoral offenses commission, but I must say that I didn't support that recommendation. I continue to believe that we should strengthen existing institutions and enable them to perform their responsibilities. Thank you.
Similar vein, a question for Professor Remy is about the management of political parties, their disputes, and their primaries. And so my question for you is, would removing the responsibility of party oversight from INEC and the creation of a commission for the registration and regulation of political parties, would that help address some of the issues that we saw in this process regarding political parties? Or do you have other suggestions for how political parties and their participation in electoral processes can be managed?
Good morning, everybody. This question has to do with how to rein in political godfathers. Most absolute authority and power in some of our political parties. When the person who emerges in the primaries is not in favor with the political godfather, then at times it's like all hell is let loose in the party. And there's a lot of disruption of the system. What to do about this? I'd like, first of all, to agree with what my colleague just said, that the level of desperation to get into political office itself is something that has to be addressed. The fact is that the stakes are just too high. The perquisites of electoral office in Nigeria are stupendous. So people are willing to kill and to die in order to get into those positions. And this is an issue that we must address as a nation. Now, with respect to the political parties themselves and their regulation, I don't think that it's necessary to establish another commission. Indeed, we already have this joke in Nigeria that if you don't want to do anything about a problem, just start another agency, another commission, and so on. You know, that will take us, down a road that leads nowhere. So I would not support creating another commission. However, I think that what we could do to hasten the process, because there will certainly be petitions, resulting from the conduct of the primaries and so on. Why, for example, could we not make this issue go straight, maybe to the Supreme Court, such that the matters are dealt with expeditiously? We tend to waste a lot of time, dealing with election-related matters. We have had cases where somebody almost runs out the term before they are now declared not to have won the election. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous. Therefore, we must be able to find a system to deal with that and ensure that the issue is resolved before the election is supposed to take place. And it might be that making it a statutory matter, going straight maybe to the Supreme Court, might be able to help us to deal with that. But if we still want to go the whole hog of the different, High Court and the Appeal Court and so on, we must give a limit such that matters are resolved well in time before the election takes place. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and a lot of the frustrations that we've heard from Nigerians, many of the recommendations that have been made in the past, including recommendations made by Nigerian, and there is a sense that if these recommendations were implemented, they could improve significantly the conduct of elections in Nigeria. Of course, Honorable, I'll come back to you, because there are things that should be fixed by law, but there are also other things that could be fixed by guidelines or just very practical steps that could be taken to modernize the electoral process. And I'm thinking about the use of IT, information technology. And being a younger generation politician, I'm sure that you have become very familiar with IT systems and how the use of information technology can speed up the conduct of elections. We know that INEC is undertaking some improvements, some innovations with regards to voter registration and the voter card, and those are good. But on the end side of it, the transmission of election results, still slows down the process considerably. Would you be favorable to giving INEC the support that it needs to engage IT tools to speed up the transmission, the tabulation, collation, and transmission of election results? As a legislator, do you think that's a favorable direction to go in?
I'll start with the voters card. The way and manner voters card are produced begins to create a level of discomfort, and people begin to get jittery, as in you get to go for your registration today and then it takes months before you get your voter's card. Let's look at the banking system as a point of reference, where you have your money in the bank and the bank requires to give you every form of security. You walk into the bank, within a matter of minutes, you get your ATM, and you get to use your ATM card anywhere, any bank and any ATM machine around. I think Nigerians, not just the Nigerian government, should look at our votes as important as the money we have in the bank. Because our votes is the money that Nigeria has. So we should be able to guard our votes right from the process of putting up the voter's card to the point of election and even transmitting the accurate results to the electoral body. That makes the electoral body credible. So for me as an individual, I will promote such level of transparency at the National Assembly whenever such a matter is brought up to the National Assembly to discuss this. But I would like to throw up the challenge to Nigerians as a whole, not just those in government, but it is our collective responsibility to actually begin to demand for such level of credibility from the electoral bodies. And in terms of collating results, we all talk about polling units, that there are some polling units that are in the villages where it is hard to access and it's difficult to have network. It should be our collective responsibility to ensure that network is everywhere. I know that if banks are interested in putting up a branch in a particular location, they pull down every form of resource and put up all the facilities required for IT, so that they get the resources that is embedded within that local community. So I think that everywhere is a city in Nigeria. We don't have villages. It is our desire and our choice to make a village a city that makes it a city. So that should not be the responsibility of the government alone. We shouldn't wait until it is 2023 before we begin to think about what network is available in that village, or what means or how do we get to collate our result and transmit it. I think that we should begin to engage businesses, corporations, even civil societies to an extent. They can lobby these telecommunication industries to set up networks in those rural communities that our electoral bodies can actually get to link up with that IT facility and provide the services required during election. But when we wait until it is time for election, it becomes very expensive. But we can spend billions when we start today, and then we spread it over 4 years, or even 8 years as it may be. So I think it depends on Nigerians, and it depends on what we are able to push for that will create that level of transparency in the collation and transmission of our votes, because our votes is our money. And if banks can invest billions, Nigerians should be able to invest much more than that. Thank you.
Address some of the structural barriers to women's participation, including in existing institutions.
Matter of women not being represented in the Nigerian political space is actually an enigma. Because on the one hand, we have a lot of women who are qualified. Very often people say, oh, for women, they need empowerment and so on and so forth. We already have a host of empowered Nigerian women. The fact is that they are not to be found in politics. They are found elsewhere, everywhere else, but in politics. That means that there is something that is keeping them away. And this is a very sad reflection on the country, because people can't understand it. Nigerian women are CEOs, they are, in the banking industry, they are all over except in politics. Even when it comes to appointive positions, it is as if our magnifying glasses are unable to find these women. It is something that must engage the nation, because what it means is that we are denying ourselves the enrichment that these women can bring to the running of our affairs. And it is known, it has been proven, that several companies that have female CEOs actually perform better. So why is it that we cannot recognize that we need to use the resources, the skills, the competences that these women have, in running our country? Therefore, I believe the time has come for legislation. I did not used to believe that, because I used to be a proud academic, I don't want any concessions. I play the game on the same level and even kill with the men. However, I think in this matter of the running of our country, we cannot wait. We must have those women brought in to help us. We need them. Therefore, I would like to suggest that we should legislate that a certain percentage of positions, both elective and appointive, be reserved for women. And when I say women, of course, I mean qualified women, okay? I'm not talking about the sister of the governor or the wife of, whoever. We are not in the era of tokenism anymore. Our situation is such that we need people who can actually do this work for us. So, however, the manner in which that would be worked out will have to be determined, because given the system that we are running right now, it might not be so obvious to say, how would you be able to work that out? But Nigerians are brilliant people, will be able to figure it out. Thank you very much.
To raise voter turnout in Nigeria, there's been some suggestions that reversing the sequence of elections or spacing the elections out would encourage more people first to start running for elective office at the grassroots level before they build up to the national level. But also spacing the elections will give more time for parties to actually campaign on issues and go towards the electorate in a way that can bring out the electorate to vote on ED. What are your perceptions on this issue of voter turnout, and how can we make it better for Nigeria going forward?
As far as the 2019 elections are concerned, I think there are both specific and general issues that may have affected the turnout. You will recall that the presidential election was postponed barely hours before the voting started. And a lot of Nigerians move about in order to go and vote. Most of the people that have wanted to vote during that election have already left for their voting spaces. And only hours before the election, it was announced that the election was postponed. So many people returned and didn't have the opportunity to go back. That is a very, very important factor in the turnout that we had in the last election. But there are also general reasons which have nothing to do with one regime or the other. To be honest with you, democracy has not been working very well for people in Nigeria. The quality or lack of it, of the governance that we dispense to our citizens is very, very low, especially at the state and local levels. People who are very close to their constituents know that, Nigerians are eking out a living in spite of government. And except for very recently, when an attempt is now being made to empower local governments, absolutely nothing is going on now in local governments. And when people don't feel the impact of governance, I mean, they feel no stake in actually coming forward to cast their votes or to participate in elections. Because as far as they are concerned, I mean, what is it worth? What is my vote worth? Eventually, if I vote, what do I get in return? So much of that, I think, contributes to the very low turnout during elections. And unless we fix that, unless we upscale and pressure people in government to deliver on the services that they promise to deliver, people will not feel any need to continue to support this system. And I think that's where the problem lies. So for the 2019 election, there is this issue of postponement of the election, which affected the turnout. But also in general, I think there are much deeper issues that have to do with the quality of governance. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Honorable Simon. Let's now give an opportunity for our friends of the press, for those of you who may have questions for us.
I'd like to congratulate the NDI and IRI because over the last couple of years they've been quite busy getting involved in preparatory activities towards the election. And I've been pretty privileged to be one of those invited to speak with women on media access, which basically is a huge challenge. And it was interesting to find, as I involved myself in that activity as a facilitator, that women have no idea how powerful the media is, no idea whatsoever. The men understand it and will stand beside, in terms of adjacency, who is relevant to their campaign more than women understand it. Culturally, we're made over the years to feel that we need to slide back. And so women need to understand that they need to be upfront. If they're running for an election, they need to be available for the media to interview, because they also tend to back out, to say, well, I have nothing to say. With Not Too Young to Run, it has been an exciting journey. And I think because women hold half the sky, there should be some kind of activity that says women are good enough to run. And if women are good enough to run, then it must start also culturally. The figures, the statistics coming out of the 2019 election indicate that the women we have in the National Assembly, the number of women in there have dropped fairly badly. It's the first time in a very long time. And it indicates a lot of things. From the statistics pulled together, it showed that there were a lot more women candidates as a result of civic education and all of that, that there were fewer women that made it through the tape. Many years ago on our way to Beijing, I interviewed Sarah Jibril, who has been running for presidency like 3 times, thereabout. And she said, well, among the political parties, it would seem that women are considered the ones who have to clap, who have to dance, and who have to be available for all the dancing and clapping. And even at the top hierarchy, women are invited to make the tea. So you're a very important personality in the party, but you're sitting around your colleagues, and they ask you to find the lunch and that kind of talk. So culturally, we need to work hard. We need to do the education better. We need to say to our children at home that the women are good enough, because that's where it starts from. When as a man, you constantly look for a male child, and you discountenance your female children and not pay them any heed, then it begins to show up in these various areas. I thank you.
The legislation has to cover every area of political activity. So within the internal party structure, such that women are not only women leaders, that we can have women in the upper hierarchy of the party, and not just the cheerleaders, dancing and clapping, right? As well as in every single level of governance, the local government, the state assemblies, the federal assembly, and also in the appointive positions at every level, the commissioners in the states, the ministers. The issue I'd like to reiterate is not to say, I mean, it's right to say it, right? We ought to be there as well. But I'd like to emphasize more the fact that we are shooting ourselves in the foot by not doing this. We are hampering the development of our country, seriously. So that's the real issue. And just to quickly mention the matter of the media that my sister Eugenia raised. Part of the experience of women also, so you are right. There are many women who go in there, they are not ready to take on the media, they shy away from the interviews and so on. But then I also found I was ready to take on all the interviews. However, most of the questions that were addressed to me were related to being a woman. So it wasn't about your competence, it wasn't about your, the fact that she's a professor, no, is of no relevance. It's still, how do you cope with your children? How do you manage, They never ask the men such questions. How do you balance home and politics and things like that? Why don't the men get asked, such questions? Why are those questions reserved only for women? So, we must build the competence of everybody. We must let everybody demonstrate to us their capacity, their ability. I think that's so important. One, if you would allow me, one final thing about the use of technology in elections. We need to run elections cheaper. The amount of money that we spend on elections in this country are not available to our hospitals, to our educational institutions, to do the infrastructure that we need. So we are sinking this amount of money into elections, but not getting the expected results. So it's like money down the drain. Technology would help us, and several good ideas have come up as to, we have an identity management place that could register us. Everybody has a BVN now, so why can't we find ways of using these structures that we already have in place to help us with our elections? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Remy.
I have made my views known severally, and they are not very popular, but those are my views, and I'm responsible for them. You see, there is always tension between equal opportunity legislation and what democracy is supposed to achieve. That's the issue of free choice. On the one hand, we want to open the space for people to vote for whoever they want. On the other, we want to restrict the space by creating legislation to protect a certain gender in order to make sure that members of that gender get into governance. The end result is good, but how to get there? I have a problem with how to get there. For example, I've been managing a political party for the last 4.5 years. You open up, our party have opened up the space for women to come forward, to participate, to pick up whatever position. In fact, on the National Executive Committee of our party, my deputy is Chief Titi Ajanaku, a woman. We have 4 other women on the national, and they all got there not through any equal opportunity legislation. They all got there by their competence. So I'd like to see a society whereby really we educate members of our society to understand that this full 50% of our population is also an asset. Not by creating Because if you create such a legislation, what you fear in the political parties is what will happen in the elections. Because, I mean, it's not the best of you that will be picked to go and represent you. So I would like a national kind of effort to open up, because women are from the word go disadvantaged economically. We have disadvantaged women everywhere. It's not just in politics. And so the thinking should be, how do we break this, this glass ceiling? Not just by legislation, but by a public attitude towards appreciating the kind of quality that women can bring into our lives. So I don't know if, generally I misunderstood when I say this, because people generally want an easy way out, create a law, so that you know. But when you create the law, to be honest with you, what is happening everywhere where people manipulate the law to put the worst of us will happen in, so you get stuck with women that really give you a bad name. So what do you do? So this is my position. Thank you.
Thank you.
From the perspective that reality is beginning to set in. And then we give INEC credit that the truth is beginning to step up. Because in a constituency where you have over 200 registered voters and less than 70 voted, it tells you that yes, it's about 30–35% of turnout. But what's the truth about it? Were there actually over 200 registered voters in that constituency? So maybe we should give credit to the electoral body for beginning to sanitize the actual number of people who register. Because in the past, what is usually done is that after elections, the remaining ballot papers are being put as people who actually cast their votes. So I think we should pick up that credit and begin to intensify that. That's a good entry point for us to sanitize the electoral system. And then on a final note, the issues around internal democracy. In most cases, people sit down and wait until general elections begin before they begin to participate. Whereas, election begins at the political party level. From people who make up the delegates, people who make up the executive offices in political parties, they get to determine who gets the tickets, though in the case of an indirect primaries. So long as the wrong people get into the office as executives, they become the delegates who do the first level of election for you. And they dance the way they understand, or the level of their own understanding, or the level of their own ignorance, however you put it. So I think we Nigerians must understand the fact that our general elections do not take, sorry, our choice of leadership does not start during general elections. Let's get back to begin let's first of all get involved in political parties and ensure that the people who become delegates are people we know are of competence, people who are able to reason. Part of the reasons why I emerged this level was that I looked at that problem as a civil society activist. I looked at the scenario from that context, and I began from building the capacity of those executives, making them understand that they have the power to determine who becomes the member of their House of Representatives. People laughed at me. Even when I consulted some organizations, they said, this is not common, we're not likely to step that. I said, okay, we'll do it together. Gradually, we get to understand that. And I conducted training for over 50% of the entire delegates within the political party. Out of 600, I trained over 300. And my target was to get not less than 300 votes. And out of 6 of us, I had 221 votes, and my first runner-up had 101. What it means is that that concept worked. So we need to understand that election starts from that point, and then to the primaries before the general election. Thank you very much.
To kind of speak to a few of the questions, I think Nigeria has demonstrated that it has the ability to be a leader on this continent, and I think, and it is perceived as such. We work across the continent, and Nigeria is looked up to very much by other systems and other countries and other citizens. And so, I think in this discussion about a way forward after 20 years of democracy. I think it's important to think about ways that more people can be brought into the system, that it can be easier for people to participate, that more Nigerians can be informed about the process and encouraged to vote, but also to run as candidates, to serve in political parties, and to participate. And so, I encourage, particularly in the area of women's participation, but across the board with young people and with folks in rural areas and across the board, I simply will leave you with an encouragement that Nigeria really step up to the plate and prove that you can be a leader in these areas. I know from many of the women that I've met in this country that they're some of the most inspiring women I've met, and so I encourage Nigerian women and men to prove that Nigeria can be a leader in terms of women's representation and participation of young people. So I'll leave you with that.
Thank you very much, Lee. That has not been spoken to is the question from our friend from Nigeria Info about how the 2019 polls compare to 2015. And we could even to see that up until 2015, there was a progressive improvement in the way in which elections were being conducted in Nigeria. Many of us were around when the 2007 elections took place and came under a lot of criticism, justifiably so. We saw some improvements in 2011, and then we saw even more improvements in 2015 when Nigeria had one of the most credible elections in the country's history, as was hailed by many Nigerians and friends of Nigeria across the world. The hope for many Nigerians was that that upward trajectory will be maintained and that 2019 will be a vast improvement again on what transpired in 2015. As we stated in our report, those expectations were not met, but our hope is that the preparations for the 2023 elections would begin now. And that's why we're hoping to spur or to contribute to these conversations, because we hope that if the conversations begin now and a lot of the reform issues that have been touched upon in our report as well as in this session are adopted in a timely fashion, that the election administration authorities, the political parties, civil society, the electorate as a whole would be so well prepared and so well versed with the electoral processes that by the time we get to 2023, we would actually see a huge and very vastly successful election that Nigerians across the board would be overwhelmingly proud of. That we will see fewer cases before election tribunals or before courts of law, because it will be an indication that there is consensus across the board with regards to the electoral outcome. I would just want to take this opportunity to thank our panelists because we called them up at short notice and they made themselves available to us. You can also see that they come from diverse backgrounds. Of the three of them, one of them is affiliated with, is a member of the ruling party. A second is a member of an opposition party that has served in government before. And a third is a member of an opposition party that has never served in government. And that represents the richness of the diversity of Nigerian politics. But they've expressed themselves this morning with us, not on behalf of their respective political parties, but as concerned Nigerians, as Nigerians that have an interest, a vested interest in seeing their country do well and seeing their elections being embraced by all Nigerians as a credible reflection of the will of the people and the desires of the Nigerian people. We sincerely thank you for making the time, and we're so inspired by your contributions to this conversation. If anything, I believe this morning's session also indicates why this national conversation is necessary. We understand that a number of initiatives are already afoot. INEC itself is planning to do a review of its performance. Civil society, led by Situation Room and groups such as Yaga Africa and others, are also thinking through reviews that can bring forward recommendations to improve the process. International partners, the Kofi Annan Foundation, the European Union, IRI, NDI, we're all in this together. We wish Nigeria well, and we would really want to thank you for your time and attention.
Festus Keyamo.
Summary of. Hold on. Are we set? Hold on. Someone was asking, yes.
Well, Festus Keyamo, Senior Advocate of Nigeria and the Director of Strategic Communication for the APC Campaign Council.
Tell us a bit about the NDI, IRI. How do you feel about their nomination?
First of all, we appreciate their efforts, the efforts of the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute for the efforts they have made so far regarding our elections. They have been with Nigeria for about 2 decades now, and they are very passionate about our progress, the progress of our democracy, and we appreciate their efforts a lot. Their reports and the suggestions they have made, they are very welcome. These are suggestions and observations that we cannot run away from. We do appreciate them. We know that there were pockets of violence across the country, and these pockets of violence affected both the ruling party and the main opposition. The deficiencies that were mentioned, the drawbacks that were mentioned, also affected both the ruling party and the main opposition. Do not also forget that it is this imperfect system that we are talking about, this imperfect system that the main opposition wishes to spin to appear as if it is the fault of the ruling party. It's that same imperfect system that produced their governors in states where we previously controlled. So that imperfect system gave them Bauchi, that imperfect system gave them Adamawa, that imperfect system gave them Imo, that imperfect system gave them Oyo, and in the presidential election we lost even some states in our stronghold in the West. We lost about 1 or 2 states in our own stronghold. It is that imperfect system that gave them those victories. So when they try to spin the story to appear as if all of these reports of these international organizations, observers, are a domination of the ruling party, is a lie. It's actually a domination of every major player in the political system. But the most important thing about the report of the NDI and the IRI, if you read it line for line, is that at the end of the day, they did not dispute the eventual outcome of the elections. They pointed out the deficiencies. For instance, they quoted the independent collation system of YAIGA, and they quoted it with approval, that it actually at the end of the day reflected the overall wishes of Nigerians. They also pointed out that the collation system at the end of the day, if despite all the hiccups, also agreed with YAIGA's own final outcome.
One of the major statements
Now,
made, Mr. Festus, that this election did not reflect the expectations of Nigerians.
Yes. They said Nigerians expected a higher standard. That's what they said, and we do agree. And like Nigerians are entitled to expect a higher standard. But the point I'm making is that even the standard we got at the end of the day, they did not say it affected substantially the outcome of the elections. They also mentioned at the end of the day that in most of the polling stations across the country, elections went on peacefully. I want you to go and read that report. So they did not say that the violence recorded in some polling stations overshadowed the overall peaceful nature of the elections. That was a point they made so eloquently, that in major parts of the country the election was also peaceful. But then we must improve on those deficiencies that they mentioned, and we do appreciate it. So yes.
How would you rate the comparison? That from the EU, which brought a lot of questions.
Yes, I was going to say your tone on Saturdays and today is markedly different. Why?
Yes, because at the end of the day, the EU did not make this kind of observation that the NDI and the International Republican made, that most of the polling was still peaceful. I appreciate that point they made so much. And that's the point we have been trying to push, that if you mention the drawbacks we have in some polling stations across the country, at the end of the day, you must make a comparative analysis. Comparative analysis to the point that, well, haven't mentioned all of this violence that happened in some polling stations and all that. What was it compared to the other ones that went on peacefully too? They made that point so eloquently that at the end of the day, the peaceful polls across the country far overshadowed. There was far more than the pockets of violence that we noticed across the country.
As a senior advocate of Nigeria, would you agree with the suggestions made that electoral petitions should be taken straight to the Supreme Court?
Well, the Supreme Court by law is not a court of trial. And in most cases, for election petitions and some other disputes, you need to go through trial first before you go to the Supreme Court. I may advocate a two-step process, but it is dangerous to also take a complaint or a grievance to just one court. In most cases, the second hierarchy of court allows the disputants to extract all the mistakes made by the lower court, and then the higher court, either the Court of Appeal or the Supreme Court, can make a final conclusion on those disputes. But when you go straight to one court at the Supreme Court, and even if there is a 10-man panel and there's a mistake made along the way in giving a judgment, nobody will have the chance again to appeal to a higher authority or institution. Thank you.
First of all, I have to clarify that the role of the observer is not to certify an election outcome. It's not to certify the election results. It's to observe and to report accurately on what we saw around the electoral process. And fortunately, because NDI and IRI working together in joint missions, observed the entire process going through multiple pre-election observation missions and then missions on election day. We got a snapshot on some of the improvements that had been made, as well as some of the challenges and shortcomings that will need to be addressed to make sure that future elections are accepted by everybody across the board. And that's why in our report, we not only talk about our findings, but we also make recommendations to help improve the electoral process.
Okay, it's very obvious. Thank you very much.
Thank you too.